Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Wonderful to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming to this wonderful Conway Hall. I'm going to very briefly say a few words before we introduce this evening's speaker, who I know you've all come to see. I think there's still a few people congregating outside, so hopefully they'll be able to come and join us upstairs. Great to be using the full space in here. My name is Mark Williamson. Those of you who've been to these Action for Happiness events before will have seen me give a little introductory spiel, so apologies if I say something that you've heard me say before. But for any of you who've not been to one of these events before, very warm welcome. Delighted you could join us. I'm going to say a little bit about what Action for Happiness is all about, and then we'll get to this evening's proceedings. We are quite simply a movement of people, including many hundreds of people in this room, who share a kind of belief that what matters most in life, both for our leaders and of course each of us as individuals, is the things that really maximise human happiness and well-being. And at the heart of that idea is that for a really happy, fulfilling life, that only really happens in a society where we care more about the happiness of others. And so this evening's theme of compassion is absolutely in line with that. It's really at the heart of what we stand for as a movement. So we're delighted that Karen could be with us this evening. If you're not familiar with our work, we do events like this. And later on I'll tell you about what's coming up next. We also do work in schools to try and promote a focus on well-being. We do work in local community groups, and in this room there are some local group leaders for Action for Happiness who run initiatives not just locally but all around the country and indeed around the world. And we also do work in organisations helping companies learn how they can create happier, more resilient and therefore more effective teams and the impact that can have on their performance. So if you'd like to know more about any of those things and get involved in what we're doing, then do come to actionforhappiness.org or talk to any of the team that are here this evening. But we're delighted you could be here, and to introduce this evening's speaker, I'm delighted that we have one of our co-founders here, Lord Richard Layard, who is a huge proponent, of course, of this well-being agenda, but is also someone who believes deeply in the heart of happiness being compassion for others. So very much an apt speaker to introduce this evening. So join me in welcoming Richard Layard.
Well, Karen, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. It's really thrilling for us because, as we all know, Karen is one of the greatest writers about religion in the world. She's, I think, written about all the great religions of the world. And what I've learned from her is that in all the religions, there is the golden rule. And that, I think, is one of the central messages in all her writing. And this is what led her, when she got, mysteriously, this TED's Prize in 2008, where she was asked what is her wish for how best to improve the state of the world. She got the ability to found this thing called the Charter for Compassion, which I hope she will say a little about, but I've just been learning a little more than I knew before. Something like 100,000 people have signed the Charter, but more important, there are dozens of cities all around the world which are considering adopting the objective of being a compassionate city, which involves not just a code, but laying out practical things which they will do to implement that code. I think this is a really, really wonderful thing. And obviously, as Mark said, it's got a lot in common with what we're trying to do in Action for Happiness. As probably most of you know, if you become a member of Action for Happiness, you pledge to lead your life to try and create as much happiness in the world around you as possible and as little misery. And obviously, leading a compassionate life is a very important component of that. Of course, there's just one little problem. It's so easy to say these things and so much more difficult to do them. There's the other, I mean, we have two natures, don't we? The one that is aspiring and would like to do good, and the one which actually thinks that each of us is at the centre of the world. And it's a little difficult to reconcile the two, and I'm really hoping that Karen is going to help us a bit to understand how the good side of us can master the not so good side. So, Karen, thank you so much. Please welcome Karen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you all for your welcome. Well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was a modern ideal. The idea that you would actually found a state in the United States to pursue the ideal of happiness. But all too often, happiness gets mixed up with emotion, whereas emotions come and go. They depend on how well you slept last night, the state of your digestion, your hormones, or purely material things. We're in a consumer society where we're constantly being told that we must have this year's must-have accessory, not realizing that the point of an accessory is that you don't have to have it. It's not necessary. But we are constantly being taught that we must have this, that, and the other. I remember as a child always thinking, if this could happen, I would be happy forever. But of course we're not. So we've got the ideal of happiness in our minds. And it's there with us always as a mirage of something we think we ought to have. And it's always just elusive, just out of reach. We might get it for a few moments and then it goes, but we still keep on trying to pursue it, trying to get it or nail it down. And what are the problems? Well, first off, we've got a very difficult brain. We've got three brains that coexist beside one another very uneasily. One is the brain that we inherited from the reptiles that crawled out of the primal slime 50 million years ago or whatever. And the reptile's brain, which is in the deepest part of our brain, it's the oldest part of our brain, is all about me. It's driven, the reptilian brain, by four main drives, which the neuroscientists call the 4 Fs: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and reproduction. The idea is that you want to perpetuate your genes, you're out to protect yourself and your territory, and you'll fight anyone that intrudes on it. You'll flee if there's danger, and you're out to get resources, to gather resources. And one of the problems is, if you just think of that for a moment, with the consumer society, these drives that we inherited were very important, but they were not designed for an age of plenty. They were designed for an age of scarcity, when people didn't have enough to eat. Now in an affluent society like our own, or relatively affluent, we keep wanting to get more and more. And we're encouraged to do so to keep the economy going. But these drives are all about me, and they are instinctive and very, very strong. If a tiger suddenly leapt into Conway Hall, we are supposed to abandon our high-minded conversation and run for our lives, fleeing. It's instinctive. The reptile thinks only of itself. It doesn't care for its young when it lays its eggs. It walks away from the eggs, and the young fend for themselves. Mammals developed other kind of centers in their brain which help them to care for other beings, care for their young. And neuroscientists say there are these hormones and reflexes in our brains that enable us to care for other people. And we develop these as human beings as a survival technique. We wouldn't have survived without the 4 Fs. You need these survival skills, but equally we needed to bond with other people because there were other dangerous predators around, and we were stronger when we lived in a group And that meant you had to learn to put the rights of other people in the group perhaps before your own. And that's all there in the brain. Finally, we human beings have a neocortex, which is the rational thinking part of our minds that enables us to stand back from these instinctive drives and take stock. Some of the worst things happen when the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain, gets mixed up with the 4 Fs. Our desire to kill, but we use it rationally, and then you have Auschwitz and 9/11. So we are a complex being, and it's very difficult for us to negotiate our way around these instinctive drives and learning to stand back and not put me first. Secondly is pain. We all suffer. Every single one of us, it doesn't matter how fortunate we may seem to be, how rich or wealthy or delightful our family, every one of us has pain. Every one of us will, if we live long enough, get old, and we'll die, and it won't be pretty. We get sick. We feel sorrow. We see people die. We are the only creatures that I think who have a knowledge of our own mortality. And we have to live with that, and we find it very difficult to do. And that pain is with us most of the time. The Buddhists' 4 noble truths say that the first noble truth is that existence is suffering. Now, the word dukkha, which is often translated suffering, really means existence is awry. There's always something wrong. If I get a fabulous job, the other candidates are all disappointed. Or something isn't, things don't last, or something isn't quite perfect. I was saying this in the United States. We had to be interviewed by Oprah Winfrey, and I was having lunch with the producers afterwards, and I was saying this, and he said, well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with my lobster salad. And I said, well, think about it from the point of view of the lobster. And he said, I never thought of it. That's the sort of awareness we need to get. When our nation prospers, and we need to think globally here, and I think we really now have to start thinking globally if we want to be happy. Other nations are often suffering because as a result of our prosperity. As a result of our colonialism in the 19th century, we have a lot of pain in the world today, and we're seeing repercussions of that in our troubled 21st century. So existence is all right, pain is there. How do we negotiate it? It's no good expecting a pain-free life. Even if we attain enlightenment like the Buddha, he still got old, tired. He lived to the age of 80 and died of dysentery in a small jungle settlement miles away from all his friends. The trick is to live with suffering, the suffering that will inevitably come our way, kindly and creatively and peacefully. And that's a great skill. It's a great work, and it is hard work. Often happiness comes upon us, doesn't it? I mean, the sun came out yesterday, and I met my neighbor, and she said, "Isn't this amazing?" But then the clouds came over, of course, again, and I noticed today in that awful wind we had earlier that the magnolia in my garden, which I had greeted with such joy on Sunday, when suddenly there was sun and it all popped out, was shaking in the breeze. I thought, oh no, it's dukkha. Existence is awry. Something will always happen. happiness can come upon us unawares, but to get that inner peace, something that enables you to live at peace with your pain, that takes time and effort. And one of the things that causes us most pain is ourselves. It's that me first capacity. That if you think, when we wake up at 3 a.m, it's always a bad time. And you lie awake, and things often seem bleak at that time. Maybe our vital signs are low or something, but you can think, why does this happen to me? Why haven't I got what X has? Why did people do that to me? And it isn't fair. And this, we go round and round and round in a rat run. So much of our anxiety is spent on status. How do we rank? How do we rate with other people? What does X think of me? When we meet somebody, or we immediately say, well, is this person threatening or not? It's like we're like animals. We're sort of testing them out. And we are constantly preoccupied with how we are, what we're looking like. Are we too fat? Are we too thin? Are we, prosperous enough, rich enough, successful enough, especially in this target-driven society? Me, me, me. Now, the great sages of the spiritual life in all the traditions have said, if you can get outside of me for a while, you can be happy. You can achieve that inner peace. The Greeks have had a word for it, ecstasis. Now, we think of ecstasy as some often doolally sort of trance, but it doesn't. It means ecstasis. It's stepping outside the self, standing outside yourself. We say sometimes, don't we, I was beside myself. Sometimes you feel beside yourself with horror. Sometimes, though, with joy. But to step outside of the self, outside that endless prism, or prison, too, of self-preoccupation, is difficult. When I was a nun, as a young woman, we did all kinds of arcane things to help us to get rid of self. We had to kiss the ground when we were late. We had to kiss other people's feet, other nuns' feet in the refectory. We had to confess our faults in public. We were constantly excoriated about our failings in public. And it was all a complete waste of time. Because all that happened was that you became absolutely so obsessed with yourself and your performance and how you were doing that you were stuck in the ego that you were trying to transcend. It was a complete waste of time, and that's why the world religions have all found the ethic of compassion. Summed up, as Richard reminded us, in the Golden Rule, which has been developed in every single one of the major world religions: never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And they've said that that is the test of true spirituality. Not doctrines, not great ascetical works, not a certain sexual ethic or believing a whole lot of stuff. Belief is very much a modern concept introduced in Western Christianity in the 17th century. We can go into that in question time if you like. Religion is a form of practical knowledge like driving or swimming, and you learn by doing it, especially the Golden Rule. The first person, as far as we know, to enunciate the Golden Rule in a form that was actually written down by his disciples was Confucius, some 500 years before the Common Era. His disciples asked him, "Master, which of your sayings can we put into practice all day and every day?" And what is the central thread that runs through all your teaching and pulls it all together? And he answered in the one Chinese word, it's shu, which means likening to the self. The golden rule, he said, asks you to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And notice he said all day and every day. We've got a habit, don't we, of saying when we've done something nice for somebody, well, that's my good deed for the day, so that we can then return to the next 23 hours to our usual selfishness, unkindness and bitterness and greed. No, all day and if we did it all day and every day, we would achieve ecstasis, constant ecstasis. And that's what Confucius's disciples found. It is they often call in the Oriental religions the path to spirituality, the way, and that is the ultimate reality. They're not concerned about what's at the end of the path. Just doing it is enough. If you do it, you get it. And it's that practice all day and every day of dethroning yourself from the center of your world and putting another there that begins to put the ego in its place. And it's not easy because of our me first capacity. And Confucius was very clear that this was not just a personal quest. He was deeply political. He said that, and the Chinese were just embarking on a terrible period in their history called the period of warring states, when over 200 years, the states of the Great Chinese Plain fought one another until only one was left. They were all eliminated, one after the other, and that remaining state became the empire. And that reminds us that the Golden Rule was formulated by people such as the Buddha and Jesus and Hillel, Confucius, not by people living in idyllic surroundings in some pleasant spot in a happy grove on a mountaintop. They were always formulated in tough societies like our own, where violence had reached an unprecedented crescendo. And the sages knew that another Chinese sage, Mozi, said, you must practice also yan ai. You cannot confine your benevolence to your own congenial group. You must have concern for everybody. That's the only way to get peace, he said, because if we don't start behaving like this, we will destroy ourselves. No prince would invade another state if he practiced yan ai, said Mozi, because he wouldn't like that to happen to his own state. When Confucius was asked, how do you apply this to politics? He said it's quite simple. You seek to establish yourself, then seek to establish others. You want to turn your merit to account, then make sure that others have the opportunity to turn their merit to account. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. Go among the common people as if you were in the presence of an important guest. Treating people with absolute respect. If we had done that more in the past, internationally, we would not be having so many problems today. And that's where we want to have a happy society. We are not going to have a happy society unless we implement the Golden Rule globally. Look what happened in Boston. We don't know, I don't think it has been any news, they've got any, who did it. But disaffected groups festering on the edge of society, often because they've been ridiculed or marginalized, colonized or oppressed in some way for selfish short-term goals. We cannot afford this any longer. Now, I wrote a book called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. And 12 Steps, you'll recall at once, Alcoholics Anonymous. And quite deliberately, because we're addicted to our pet hates and pet dislikes. We don't know what we'd do without them. I sometimes see people looking mutinous in the audience because can I never say anything vile about my ex-wife or my boss or my annoying sibling or terrible colleague or that nation with whom I'm at war? No, because you wouldn't like to have it said of yourself. And that universal approach is essential. They all insist on yan I, concern for everybody. Love the stranger, says Leviticus. If a stranger lives with you in your land, do not molest him. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourselves, because you were strangers in Egypt. Remember your own pain, and here's where we use our pain to help us reach out to others. Remember your own pain when you were a despised minority in Egypt, and then refuse to inflict that pain on the people who are strangers or marginalized in your society. It's the impulse of the golden rule. Love your enemies, said Jesus. And I think I'll probably try and say a little bit about that towards the end. And reach out to all tribes and nations, said the Quran. Not one of you can be a believer, said the Prophet Muhammad, unless he desires for his neighbor what he desires for himself. The same ethos, always coming back to using, as Confucius said, use your own feelings as a guide to the treatment of others. Now, the trouble is we are so addicted to our likes and dislikes. We don't know what we'd do without them. We depend upon them for our sense of self. Our enemies, and we're not necessarily talking about Al-Qaeda here, we all have enemies much nearer home, or people we don't like. We brood upon these people. We meditate on them. We go rehearse over and over their bad qualities. And we become like them. We become almost the twin of, it's a sort of shadow self we carry around with us. And it makes us small. And it narrows our horizons. And it is not conducive to happiness. And if that person, you got rid of him, somebody else would appear to take his or her place. That's the way. Life is dukkha. Someone will perform that unpleasant role in your life. So that's why 12 steps, it was designed to wean, just as in Alcoholics Anonymous, where you wean yourself step by step away from something on which you are totally addicted and dependent. It was a way of taking this ethos one step at a time to getting rid of this utter selfishness that lies at the heart of every single one of us. I myself, as a young woman, was extraordinarily unhappy. When I left my convent, I existed in a state of depression, I think, for about 6 years. Because everyone thought it would be great, I'd be leaping out, going out with men, sort of wearing beautiful clothes, traveling, making money. I was utterly lost because it was a very difficult transition to make. It was a kind of bereavement, not unlike a bad divorce. And I also suffered from a neurological illness, birth injury, which was giving me dreadful moments of terror and anguish and pain and fear. And it wasn't diagnosed, not until I was in my mid-30s. So I was in and out of mental hospitals, and I thought I was anorexic, I was suicidal. I thought I was going to end my days in a locked ward. Happiest day was when I got my diagnosis, and then I could move on. But even then, everything I did till I was about 50 failed. Every 6 years ago, everything I've been working for went down the tube. I failed my PhD with horrible publicity. Then I went into school teaching, and because of my health, was asked to leave, and I was invalided out. Then I went into television. I said that to Bill Moyers, the great American broadcaster, and he said, "Oh, we take anybody." And and after 6 years, that ended in absolute disaster too. And after that, I went off. My life was just emptied because all my associates and friends in that world had gone. And I was living in a very remote part of East Finchley. It was all I could afford. And I was absolutely alone. Now that you would think might be a bad thing, but in fact it wasn't too bad, because I was starting to research my book called A History of God. And my books up until that point had been extremely angry, very mad with religion, and clever, sniping, and small, I think. And this started to change. Because there was just me and the texts. There was no television crew to egg me on to be outrageous. And the text started to speak to me in a new way, because theology is poetry. And you can't read a poem in a nightclub. You have to have a certain silence and reciprocity. And I found a footnote in a very sort of scholarly tome, and it was talking about an abstruse form of Islamic spirituality. And it said that the historian of religion must not approach the spiritualities of the past from the vantage point of post-Enlightenment rationalism. You've got to empty yourself of your preconceptions and enter into the mind of those people who thought these things. He called it the science of compassion. Science, not in the sense of physics or chemistry, but scientia, knowledge that comes from feeling with the other. And so in a scholarly way, he said, you have to build up a picture of what's going on in that world, culturally, economically, politically, intellectually. What were the problems of that society? And not leave yourself until you can imagine yourself feeling the same. If you can do that, he said, this was Louis Massignon, the great Islamist scholar, he said, if you can do that, you will broaden your horizons and make a room for the other in your mind and heart. And I thought that struck me. I thought that's what I must do. And that meant I had to put clever, over-educated Karen on the back burner for 6 hours a day and enter into other people's minds and hearts. And I became happier, much more peaceful, much more vulnerable in a way. People used to say to me, I'd hate to be your enemy. Or, do you realize you'd never say anything nice about anybody? Because I was so wounded, like a sort of wounded animal, I was lashing out with those 4 Fs were getting in the way. This was a practice. It was the discipline of ecstasy. Not that I was falling into trances at my desk, but I was having to step outside myself for all day long. And then I found, when I got into social life, how I could not bear listening to the way other people spoke about one another in casual conversation. They spoke with such omniscience. Oh, well, the trouble with her is, as though you could sum up the mystery of every single human being that you meet in a single sentence. Or, oh, well, you know, she's always. And we do it also with whole cultures and whole societies. The trouble with Islam is. And another text I found very early in my career was by the great Sufi philosopher, 12th, 13th century, Ibn Arabi. And he said, "Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you will fail to realize the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, 'Wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah.' Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature. And in praising it, he praises himself, which he would not do if he were just. But his dislike is based on ignorance." And I think once we live in an age of information, and we think we know exactly what we're talking about, and we blast off about this, that, and the other on phone-ins and talk shows, and I'm often on them myself. And when you see we don't listen to one another either. Dialogue's one of those buzzwords we have. But dialogue, we're going to enter into dialogue with these people. It simply means bludgeoning them to accept our point of view. That's not a dialogue, that's diatribe. When people came to speak to Socrates and engage in dialogue with him, nobody could win, because a dialogue always ended with everybody realizing that they didn't know what they were talking about. And at that moment, Socrates said, "You become a philosopher because you realize that you know nothing." And on the last day of his life, he said that he was wise in only one respect, because he knew nothing at all. We identify ourselves so sharply with our own opinions, we interject ourselves into what we say, that we cut other people's and other individuals down to size. There's a passage in Hamlet that has always struck me. You'll know the story, of course, but just in case you're a bit rusty, Hamlet has been causing a lot of problems in the Danish court. And the king sets two of his old friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to spy on him. And it doesn't take Hamlet long to realize what's going on. And so one night he approaches Guildenstern with a pipe, a recorder. And he says, I pray you, play upon this pipe." "My lord, I cannot," says Guildenstern. "Why not?" says Hamlet. And here it's as easy as lying. And then and here I'm paraphrasing, it says, "It's nothing to it. You just blow down this tube, wiggle your fingers around, and out comes the music." "My lord, I have not the skill," says Guildenstern. "Why, look you now," says Hamlet, "what a poor thing you would make of me. You would play upon me like this pipe. You would pluck out all my stops. You would play me to the top of my bent. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery." And how often we do that to other people in our lives, even in our minds, cutting people down to size in our minds, making our minds smaller, imprisoning ourselves in ourselves. And injuring the other person in our thoughts, and missing the encounter with absolute mystery. Each one of us is a mystery. Ibn Arabi, whom I mentioned earlier, said that every single one of us is a unique and unrepeatable revelation of God to the world. And our job is to look beneath the unpromising exterior to see that mystery in the other person instead of cutting them down to size. And what we do, we make ourselves unhappy because when we behave like that, we spread misery around us. People feel that they're not listened to, or that they're not appreciated, or that they're slighted or summed up. And that comes back to us. We create a toxic thing, a toxic space around ourselves. So what we need is to let go of some of our opinions. Because when we're holding on to ourselves, we make ourselves small. There's a myth about the Buddha, and a myth, of course, is not something that isn't true. A myth, we've lost the spirit of that in the modern age, but a myth was a program for action. It was telling you things about the more elusive aspects of life, but it was telling you you had to do something. And this myth of the Buddha's decision to leave home and become a monk was a story. It wasn't supposed to be historically true, but it was telling every Buddhist what he or she must do to gain that ecstasy, that enlightenment, that departure from the self. And it says that when the Buddha was just born, his father invited some of the priests, local priests, to tell the child's fortune. And one of them predicted that the child would become a monk. This was not great news to the Buddha's father, who had more sort of greater ambitions for his son. But he said the priest said he would see 4 very disturbing sights, and that would impel him to leave home and become a monk. So the king immured the little boy in a sort of pleasure palace. And all around the grounds he planted guards so that no disturbing sight could ever come into anywhere near this child. And the Buddha remained until he was the age of 29 in this fool's paradise. And finally, the gods got impatient because they knew he was destined to be a Buddha, so they sent in 4 gods disguised as a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and a monk, past the guards. And the Buddha was so shocked that he left home that very night to find a solution to the world's pain. Now, Buddhism is a very psychological religion, and that image of the pleasure park surrounded by guards is a wonderful image of the mind in denial. We think we'll be happy if we keep suffering at bay and keep it outside, but it's foolish, because suffering will always break in on us somewhere or another. And and we have to allow it to break in. The pain of the world needs to be, and it needs to break our heart so that we reach out to the world in compassion. And that tightness, that we are all so often on guard. As the Confucians said, we create in ourselves a sense of deliberate heartlessness so that we won't be hurt by other people's pain or even our own. And it's pointless and says we're wasting too much energy on that. Let it in and let it break our hearts. And then, in the Buddhist frame of reference, the word karuna, for compassion, means that you take responsibility for the world's pain. The pain in your immediate environment and the pain of the world all around you. When the Buddha finally achieved enlightenment, he thought, well, perhaps I ought to teach my method. And then he thought, no, I'm not doing that. No one's going to want to do it. No one wants to leave their selves behind. They're addicted to their likes and dislikes and selfishness. I'm not going to do it. I'm staying here luxuriating in this happiness. And then the god Brahma, from the highest heaven, uttered a terrible cry. And he came down to earth, and the god knelt before the enlightened man and said, please teach your Dharma, your teaching. And he said, look at the world. And it says, the text says that the Buddha looked at the world with the eyes of the Buddha, and he saw the pain of the world. And he spent the next 40 years of his life tramping around the streets of India trying to tell people how to deal with their pain. So don't go away from pain, move somehow towards it. And I said I'd speak a little bit about love your enemies. When Jesus said that, he was doing a bit of rabbinic midrash, where you take a text from Scripture and you improve on it. That's what he's doing, or you take it into a new context. He is commenting on Leviticus, love your neighbor. And the Hebrew there is hesed, and it doesn't mean love in the sense in which we use this term today. It's got so debased in the English language. All you need is love. What on earth does it mean? We say, I love ice cream. Didn't you love that movie? And it's as though it always depends on feeling, which comes and goes, as I said at the beginning. Love was hesed. It was a technical legal term used in the ancient Near East in international treaties, when two kings who may have been enemies promised to love each other. That didn't mean they fell into each other's arms, but that they would look out for each other, give each other practical help, come to their aid whenever they were in trouble, even if that meant putting their own needs to one side, and coming always to their defense. And this is the kind of love we have to have, even for the people we regard as enemies, if we want a happy life for ourselves and our children, and the generation after that. If we don't, we won't have a viable world. And I think once we let the barriers down and let ourselves feel, if we don't allow ourselves fully to feel our own pain, we will not be we'll be harsh with the pain and dismissive of the pain of others. Let the suffering of other people break your heart, because you're beginning to break down those defensive structures that use up so much of our psychic energy, just holding trouble away at bay. And I'm just going to end with a story from the Iliad, which is an ecstasy. It's a moment of ecstasy when you're taken beyond yourself. And the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, as you know, tells the story of one short incident in the 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. In the course of this, Achilles, the chief warrior on the Greek side, he has a quarrel with his king and goes off and sulks in his tent and withdraws all his men from the war. And this is absolutely disastrous for the Greeks. And in the course of the ensuing confusion, Achilles' beloved friend Patroclus is killed by Hector, one of the Trojan princes. And Achilles goes mad with grief and rage and guilt. And he challenges Hector to a duel. And the two men fight it out in front of both armies lined up to watch. And Hector's family, the royal family of Troy, watch from the city walls. And Achilles, of course, kills Hector. No one can beat Achilles. And he then mutilates his body. In front of the royal family, he ties it to the back of his war chariot and drives it round and round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give Hector's body back to his family for burial. And that meant that in Greek terms, Hector's soul, his spirit, would know no rest. It would wander unhappy and alone for the whole of eternity. And then one night, into the Greek camp comes King Priam, king of Troy, the old man. And he is in disguise, of course. He gets to Achilles' tent and he throws off his disguise. And everybody's shocked, of course. They come right into enemy territory. The old man falls at Achilles' feet and embraces his knees and weeps. He's come to ask for the body of his son, and he weeps not only for Hector, but for all the other sons whom Achilles has killed in the war. And Achilles looks at the old man, and he sees his father in that old man. He remembers his own father, and he begins to weep. And the two men weep together. The Greeks believed that to weep together created a bond between men, because you realized you were not alone in your pain. And the sound of their weeping fills the tent. Priam weeping for his sons, and Achilles, Homer tells us, weeping now for his father, now for Patroclus. And then they stop. There's a silence, a very numinous silence. And the two look at each other, and Achilles goes and fetches Hector's body, and he lays it in Priam's arms very, very gently and carefully, afraid that the weight will be too much for the old man. And the two men then look at each other, Homer says, and each sees the other as a god. You see, I think that is where, if we can accept that we have pain, use that pain not to injure other people, but to realize that our enemies have pain. We transcend ourselves and learn to live creatively and kindly with our suffering. And that's, I think, is the guide to peace and happiness. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much for a wonderful, moving and profoundly enlightening talk. So I'm sure all of you have got many questions you'd like to ask Karen following that, so I'll happily try and take those. Just a couple of logistical points. First of all, we're going to have a hard finish at about 8:30, so if you can stay till 8:30, please do, and we're going to have to cut things off then, regardless of where we've got to. Secondly, unfortunately, we only have one roving mic today. I'm so sorry. So two things. One is, after I've taken each question, we're going to give Karen a little moment just to reflect on the question, and we're then going to get the microphone to the next question so we can keep things moving quickly. And if you are upstairs and you feel you're willing to shout to make your voice heard, unfortunately we can't get a microphone to you, but very happy to take questions from up there as well. So by show of hands, would anyone like to start things off with a question for Karen following that wonderful and wide-ranging talk on compassion? Yes, lady at the back here. There's a microphone on its way to you, so wait a moment, please.
Thanks. Hi, Karen. My question is, in regards, you spoke tonight about our individual capacity to feel the pain and suffering of another. One of the things that I see is that in our world, when we generalise and make statements or assertions like the corporate this or the society of that, when we make a collective statement about a group of individuals, it depersonalises our ability to connect with them. So in our language and our patterns of how we operate in society, by attributing blame to corporates or attributing blame to cultures or religions or societies, what would you say is the way to penetrate and raise consciousness of each of us as individuals to be able to have an ability to penetrate through that theoretical or conceptual, literal concept of how we transact in our language and actually get to the heart of the matter, which is to the individuals in the corporates, the individuals in society?
Well, it's step 7 of my 12 steps, which is remember how little you know. Because when we sound off on if you are listening to some phone in and you happen to know something about what's going on, about what they're discussing, it's astonishing the confidence with which people hold forth on subjects which, if you gave them an examination, the amount of reliable information they actually possess could be comfortably contained on the back of a small postcard. And we're encouraged to do this. Oh, I've got my right to my opinion, etc. Of course you have, and free speech is a wonderful thing, but remember how little you know. And a good exercise is to ask yourself, when someone is really irritating you in the office, for example, how much do you really know about that person? Do you know what wakes him up at night? Do you know what her childhood was like? If we don't, if we don't know much about an individual, how much the less we know about even a culture or a society. How much, when you're sounding off about a culture or a nation, how much of that history do you really know? If you were asked to take an examination in it when you're talking so omnisciently, how do you think you do? Keep reminding yourself, and it's a good exercise, how much do I know this person? We all have griefs and pains, and that we cannot share with anybody. We don't know anyone to know anything. I'm not thinking about really interesting sins and dramatic sins that are fascinating. I'm thinking of those little meannesses that we all have that we wouldn't want our nearest and dearest to know about. Little sort of fantasies of self-pity and how everybody has these. Everybody has flaws, including yourself. So we are living in a world where so many of the things that we thought we were certain about have proved to have feet of clay. Look at our financial institutions. Our foreign policy clearly isn't working. We don't know what to do about the environment. And yet we've got to unlearn some of what we know in order to, it's what the Taoists call the art of forgetting. Do that with other people. Remind yourself, with this person that I want to brain, how do I know what she has suffered in her life? Or what she fears with good reason? Or what sickness she has? And then once you start doing it with individuals, it sort of wears off and you find yourself asking, well, how much do I really know about that country? Apart from a few sound bites on the news, which give you a sort of an impression of omniscience.
Thank you. The microphone's already with someone here. Can I see a show of hands for where we're going next, though, please? Who'd like to ask the next question after this one? So just if we could bring it down to the front afterwards. Oh, sorry, you're pointing up there. Okay, well, I'm afraid we can't get a microphone there, but we'll come to you next. Thank you. Over to you.
Yesterday, we saw a huge and incredibly divisive funeral take place in
Where
London.
are you? Oh, okay, you're right. Yes, yes.
And what I'm interested in is, how can we bring compassion into politics?
Well, it's like the only more difficult thing was what I was asked in Holland, in Utrecht last week, was how can we bring compassion into academic life? And I agree. I mean, the trouble with our discourse, our political discourse, is this, and this links up with what you were saying. It is not enough for us to seek the truth. we also have to defeat and humiliate our opponents. We're not really interested in listening to the other person. We're just thinking of the next brilliant remark that we're going to make to cut him or her down to size. And this is what politics is about. You know, people say, well, you should get your charter of compassion to politicians. I have no hope of them, to be honest. I said that once, and the mayor of the city was in tears, apparently, because she was distressed by that. But I think I'm very proud to live in a democratic society with free speech, but I also feel that democracy has its limits, because people vote for things they know nothing about, and politicians are simply concerned with getting a vote. And it's ego. It's ego, ego, ego. And there's so many different professions, and the academic life's another one. I can say that safely, as I'm a sort of reject of academia. But where no one can possibly allow themselves to think, I don't know what on earth we're going to do about this. They've always got to come snapping out. And when you hear them just banging on when something awful's happened, all they do is say what the other side did wrong. And I think, you know, it's almost like fiddling while Rome burned. I was quite glad that there weren't any really overt, awful demonstrations. I mean, I have to say that Mrs. Thatcher was not my favourite politician, but the woman was a human being, and that coffin, as we were reminded, is where we'll all be one day. And we don't know what was in her heart. I don't know the woman, I just, you know, didn't like some of her policies. But people feel self-righteous too when they sort of say, I hate Mrs. Thatcher. I have a sort of checklist we have to speak out against injustice and cruelty wherever we hear it, wherever we find it. There's absolutely that's no argument about that. But when you do, ask yourself with Gandhi, are you speaking in order to make things better or to punish? And if it's to punish, it will do no good. And so I think, I'm not thinking of spreading this message around in the House of Commons. I mean, I don't think they'd be interested at all. But I think the public needs to show they're sick of this debate. People are not voting because it just looks as though the politicians are having a game among themselves. But remember again how little you know, and the point of dialogue and debate when we're in as much trouble as we are at the moment is to allow yourself to be changed by the conversation instead of sticking to party lines. And again, it's sort of ego that gets in the way. If you want to be a politician, you've got to have an ego, or you wouldn't last 2 minutes, I wouldn't think. But this is a flaw and the endless courting for popularity too is again a trap for the unwary. I don't know what the solution is, but it's been a divisive week, and a lot of pain has come up with people who felt they were injured by Mrs. Thatcher's policies, and that we have to take that into account too. I don't know, and neither was I able to offer much solace for academic life either. But remember, when you listen to these debates, that there's no point in entering a dialogue or a debate unless you're prepared to be changed by the encounter. That doesn't mean that you are going to immediately change your mind and go over to the other side, but that you will really open your heart and mind to that point of view and allow it to change you in a way. Then we might be able to move forward from the kind of impasse we're in at the moment.
Thank you. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher was famous for her conviction and unwillingness to change in many ways. So let's take this question up here, and I'll relay it to the audience if we can't hear it.
I just found it very interesting that focus is away
others the way they want to be treated?
Yeah, absolutely.
So can I just repeat the question for anyone who didn't hear it? So I'm not sure if you all caught that, but as well as thinking about looking inside ourselves when thinking about compassion, is there not a sense of us being willing to go outside ourselves and be more able to see how others would like to be treated? Is that
Definitely. I mean, this is the whole point. This is why Buddha did not stay under the Bodhi tree, luxuriating in his inner peace. And the pain that you suffer and that you acknowledge should impel you out to heal the pain of others. But it requires a constant effort of imagination and a lot of intelligence to put yourself in other people's shoes. It doesn't mean that you go around say, well, I'd like, when people say, oh, well, I told her this dreadful thing about her husband having an affair. Well, I'd want to know, would you? And you don't know what you may do, but you don't know that she would. And it's similarly what we do with peoples. Well, I'd want democracy brought to my country. Would you, at the point of a gun? And I think so. You've got to see where you've got to really start getting to know other people. It's getting to know their history, getting to know their preoccupations on an individual level and on a national level, because otherwise you'll just go around projecting and creating more pain. I have no patience for the kind of spirituality that's simply polishing and you want the self. My horror for the Charter would be if it consisted of whole groups of people stuck on step 3, which is compassion for yourself. And it's one people keep picking up, and I say, yep, but that's only step 3. There are 9 more to go that compel you out into the outside world. I don't want a whole lot of people, meditating and forgiving themselves and all that. That's a step, and you have to go through it. Because if you're harsh on yourself, you'll be harsh on other people too. But then you've got to move out. As the Buddha said, after enlightenment, a man must go back to the marketplace and there practice compassion for all beings.
Thank you. I think the microphone's found its way to someone at the back, but let's just see. Let's go. Oh, you've got it here. Sorry. So let's go to this gentleman here. Can I see a show of hands for the next question after this? And then to the gentleman at the back, please, Jesse. Thanks.
Firstly, just a statement. I think you were much too harsh on yourself. I loved all your earlier books, and I learned a lot from them as well as your later books. I think you were very unfair to yourself on that. But my question to you is, how would you handle things like the psychopaths that you might say that are running parts of industry and society, or despots? How would you interact with them? Or are you saying I can't change them? Look, this is hard work. It's no good sitting down at the piano and expecting to play Rachmaninoff's concerto straight off without a lesson. It's no good starting to say, I'm going to be filled with love for the members of Al-Qaeda, or that particular hideous politician, or this appalling boss. These are huge sort of images of hate we've got. First, start off, as Confucius said, as the Buddhists say, with the people near to hand whom you don't like. That's harder. And I'm thinking of, we've all got them, and we've all got people who've injured us, or people we envy, etc. Start with that. Start asking yourself, as I said earlier, how little you know about that person, really, etc., etc. Work on that. Then you start, if you're doing this quite regularly, as a habit of thought, it becomes a bit more habitual. When you start hearing about these other people mentioned, you start applying that to them too. You start thinking, well, I don't know much about them either. Part of it too is a system that we're all complicit with in a way. A system where we're in a world system where money is valued. We keep on bleating on about what a wonderful free society we have. And it is wonderful in many ways. We're extraordinarily privileged to live in a country such as this. But on the other hand, it has its flaws. and we want money. We're encouraged to want money, and we are told that the economy must make money, and so there are people trained to do that on our behalf, and they go berserk with it. But we are complicit in that too, in sort of going along with the values of a money-driven and a capitalist society. And capitalism seems to be the only form of society that works in modernity. Modernity is deeply problematical. We keep on trying to spread it to other people, and I'm not surprised they don't want it. And because we arrived at it with great pain and violence and sorrow, which I've been writing about all day, and and these monstrosities occur. You know, these bankers, etc. Who, you know, and yet they've been. This is part of. They're part of us too. They're part of the society that we live in. And if you're just going to say, well, they're beyond redemption, we can hate them, you're taking out your own responsibility for voting in the way that you do, or you know, having in miniature, perhaps, some of those same values. And do you never behave like that yourself with other people? In an analogous way, selfishly, purely egotistically, entirely for your own gain. Do you never do that with other people in your family or in your business career? We have a great capacity for unkindness and nastiness and selfishness. And so when you start excoriating others, one thing too, my checklist for St. Paul, you know, charity is patient, it's kind. Charity is not puffed up. Sometimes when people are inveighing against these awful people, they positively swell before your eyes with delighted self-congratulation. Or charity takes no delight in the wrongdoings of others. People sometimes, it comes to the Thatcher point, people obviously smacking their lips in pleasure and self-approval, you know, self-righteousness when they're excoriating the bad behavior of other people. So just remind yourself of those awful things that you think and do, and ask yourself, if I had that power, and if I was earning those vast salaries, would I give it all up for the poor, or would I? Who knows? We all like to think we would sort of immediately abandon our sort of £1 million pension or something, but would we? When we're mean with all kinds of people on a smaller scale in our ordinary existence.
Something to think about. So, gentleman at the back's taking the next question, and then Jessie, could we come to this lady in the pink top next, and then we'll move to this side of the room afterwards.
We're very interested in the organisation I work with Compassionate Cities as an idea, as a kind of policy initiative to engage a whole range of things that we've talked about: society sustainability, community cohesion, compassionate end of life. But there is a bit of me that holds back, that says, do I sully something that actually is quite inspirationally pure by putting it into politics and by attaching these other things to it to try and engage, support and get cities engaged in really making a difference?
Well, you see, if we do that, we'd never do anything. We'd sit around and sort of say, oh, it mustn't do anything in case it gets messed up. We always mess things up. We have a genius for messing things up. But frankly, if compassion, I'm not even thinking of politicians. Because, you know, they're not interested, and, you know, that's it. I mean, they'd probably use it, you know, have me shaking hands, you know, in some foreign country where they're saying they're endorsing the Charter, when they're doing God knows what to their own people. So I'm wary of that. It's interesting to me that businessmen have come forward to help me. not necessarily religious, but business people, because they looked into the abyss of 2008 and they said that's what happened when greed gets out of control. Now, if compassion can't work in the city, it's an obsolete virtue. It's no good sitting and practicing compassion in some pretty country village or pastoral grove. The essence of our society is the city, with all its ugliness and its beauty, and its grandeur, and its culture, and its homelessness, and its poverty, and its violence. Now, somehow, you've got to find a way, and that's what these groups are trying to do in a very practical way. What they do is they generally have a shadow city council that kind of looks at what's going on in things like homelessness or health or the elderly. They also undertake a community project each year to raise awareness. The idea is to constantly bring compassion from the lumber room of our minds to the forefront of our minds, so that it comes into the way you think. And having a project could be that the community actually needs that year. You work on it. One thing, I'll give you one example of how the thing works. In Seattle, which was the first of these cities to declare itself a compassionate city, doesn't mean it is compassionate, but that it's going to try and become so, more compassionate. So there was a terrible shooting incident, and a Native American was crossing the street, and he had his headphones on, and he didn't hear the policeman calling to him to stop, and the policeman shot him. And the whole city was in an uproar. Everyone was hurling abuse at the police department, hurling abuse at the county, the council, city council, at the mayor. They were snarling back, and it was just awful. This group of businessmen from Microsoft, they found out that the young man who died had belonged to a family of very famous Native American woodcarvers. So they got together with American woodcarvers in the area, and together the Native Americans and the Americans carved a huge and beautiful totem pole in that young man's memory. And it was erected permanently right in the center of Seattle by the mayor in a ceremony with a plaque. And that was a kind of healing, creative thing. What we're trying to do is get people to, think in terms of compassion. It's so dropped out of our lexicon that people often think it means pity or feeling sorry for people, or some kind of hippie kind of quality. Just to find an imaginative way, think outside the box, to think how you can make healing where there's ugliness. There'll be another catastrophe tomorrow. That's life is dukkha. But still with this one, you just see how you can live creatively with that pain and that horror. That's all we can do. And in Pakistan, for example, which is right on the front line of so many of the problems that is destroying our world, they are working so hard for the Charter because they say it's their last chance, and working especially on education, and and we have to do what we can, and sometimes we'll foul up. But if you just sit on the sidelines because you don't want something pure to get sullied, then you are not fulfilling your duty as a human being. Every single one person can make a difference to the world. Gandhi and Martin Luther King both had flaws. They were very flawed individuals, one way and another. But look what they did. And that's what each one of us can do. It's not, people say, oh, well, this isn't for me, I'm just an ordinary person. So were they. Each one of us, when we come to die, we should be asking ourselves whether the world is a little bit of a better place because we've lived in it, despite all our mistakes.
Absolutely. So we've got the lady here, and then we're going to probably for our very last question, I think, we'll come to this lady at the front row here, Jessie. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, I'm over here.
Okay, yes.
There's quite a lot of academic research coming out about the benefits of compassion, and Stanford University at the end of the month will be holding a big conference called Compassion in Business, including lots and lots of different academics and corporate players, including Google and the Search Inside Yourself course and some of the other initiatives. Do you think that we've reached a tipping point, and is a conference like that something you'd be willing to participate in?
Yeah, I'm in touch with the Stanford people a lot. They're working with us, they're partners with it. And this was partly engineered by our group in Seattle, too. So, who came down, and the Charter for Compassion is working with Stanford on this project, and absolutely. I think there is a tipping point. I think people have realized that we are in a very bad place indeed. Not just with our business, with our politics, with our environment, with our societies, with our healthcare, with so many things. And the way the world is filled with these angry people who have a point. I can understand why they're angry. I think that if I had not had such an extremely privileged life, I could easily have been a terrorist. We all have that capacity within us. So, I think we have reached a point where, but there's, on the other hand, it's no good saying, well, we've reached this tipping point so we can all sit back and Stanford can get on with it. No, basically, we all have to do it a bit, whether we're at Stanford or over here in London, or, where nothing, I say, is happening for the Charter. We all have to do what we can, because the majority of the world is not going the compassionate way at the moment. Politics isn't, business by and large isn't. When we're going ahead with all our selfish policies, we're not learning from any of our mistakes. All these people during the Arab Spring who were saying, "Thank goodness they're free," when it was our governments that have been keeping these dictators in power. We don't realise our complicit. We're not thinking seriously. We're not taking our democracy seriously, because to take our democracy seriously, we have to learn about other countries, learn what our governments are doing, and whether what they're doing is right. There's huge work to be done. And it won't just happen because people have a glitzy conference. We also need some grassroots work too. And every one of us can do that in our particular field. What we should be doing is looking round at your own field. This is step 2. And find out, what can I do to make this, my family, my school, my city, my nation, a better place? What can I do in my particular circle? Because that's our duty.
Absolutely. I promise we did this one final question down here, if we can make it a quick one, because we're pretty much at time.
I know, that was a good ending point as well, sorry. Do we therefore need to rethink our criminal justice system and our conceptions of blame and responsibility?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry, I was saying it quickly. Do we therefore need to rethink our criminal justice system and our conceptions of blame and responsibility?
I think we always need to sort of look over our justice system. Justice is rough justice. And I think we need to think what our prisons are doing. What are we doing with our prisons? Are we punishing or reclaiming people? Justice, certainly, no question about it. But so also, health, elderly, that's another thing. Helping people to die, that's another thing, instead of shoving them in homes. And there's so many things that are wrong in our society that could be a bit better. If you're in the field of legal, one of our cities, Louisville in Kentucky, is concentrating on legal and justice matters. And they're right in the Bible Belt there with a divide between black and white. citizens, and that, again, they're taking that seriously, but it takes effort, and it takes grassroots effort, and there's no easy solution ever to these things. There's no plaster. When we speak about people, oh, isn't that shocking, we say, and judging as though we knew exactly, with our eyes gleaming with self-congratulation. Again, get that ego and that animus out of our sort of ethos, because in that, it's no good just blaming the justice system. We do it, we condemn people not even for crimes, but for small misdemeanors very harshly in day to day.
So we're going to have to end it there. Karen, a hugely thought-provoking and inspiring evening, and I don't think there could be, I hope you'll agree, a sort of more important topic for us globally and personally right now as the topic Karen's laid out for us this evening, and reminded us, I think, something that's very much at the heart of what many of us in this room care about, which is that although we can call for change and we want change in systems and around us, we also have to be the change in the way that we approach our lives and the way we treat others. So it's been incredibly inspiring to have you here. Thank you so much. Before we show our appreciation for Karen again, just to say our next Action for Happiness event very much links into this theme, actually. It's relatively early next month on the 9th of May, and it's with a top-rated professor from Wharton, so very much on the theme of business, but linking to compassion. Adam Grant, the professor, has just written a new book called Give and Take, which is all about his research showing that, in fact, if you look over the long term, the business leaders that succeed most are those that give and care about others on their journey rather than being ruthlessly focused on their own success. So building on that point about, is this a tipping point? Here's someone at the heart of business and academia in that world, really backing up the point that Karen's making, which is actually when we look outwards and care more about others, that transforms everyone's experience. So, Karen, thank you for being here, and thank you to all of you too. Please show your appreciation for Karen.